Nightmares are common, she said. She looked uncomfortable. Probably a gun owner, thought Hagen. For someone who saw active combat, it's not the combat that I dream about, he interrupted. Not usually. He was getting irritated with this woman. She hadn't really said anything helpful or even interesting. She kept trying to draw a link between his anti-gun movement and his military experience. But what you've done since the war, it must have affected you. Stop, he said. She did, and looked expectantly at him. I did not become active in the gun control movement because of the war, as you call it. I became active in gun control because within a month of being back in my country, I was shot 7 times while I stood in line to get a hamburger because some asshole picked up his dad's gun and decided today's the day. Hagen looked down at the floor. It was the first time he'd repeated that phrase since it happened. He hoped the therapist wouldn't press. Of course she did. Today's the day. Yeah. Hagen fiddled with his pen. His fingers were itchy. The guy walked into the restaurant, pulled out a gun, said, "That," and then opened up. I was closest to him, but I was talking to my daughter and I didn't realize he had a gun until he shot me. And your daughter? She was hit once in the shoulder. Bullet bounced off the ribs on the left side and hit her. She lost some blood, but she was okay. Hagen made a point of leaving his daughter's injury out of his campaign. The press usually did it for him, but he didn't want to capitalize on her pain. So why didn't you stop him? Hagen raised his head. Excuse me. You could have, right? You know how to disarm someone. Hagen nodded, never breaking eye contact. He wanted to be angry about this line of questioning, but somehow he couldn't muster it. So why didn't you? You weren't watching the door. Isn't that a little strange? Hagen nodded again. It was strange, and he'd beaten himself up about it ever since. He could have killed that stupid kid with his bare hands before he'd even raised his gun. If Hagen hadn't been the first person he'd shot, then he'd have been able to, but Hagen happened to be standing close enough that he made the most obvious target. But you missed it. And there's no reason for that. What? She took a sip of water from the bottle on her desk. There's no reason that it happened, Wayne. You were talking to your daughter and you didn't watch a door. But there's no reason that you should have been watching. You're not at war anymore, and you shouldn't have to watch all the time. That boy went crazy and started shooting, and you made that part of it, the gun part, into your cause because you had to do something, right? Maybe. She nodded at the clock. Let it go. Make another appointment, if you want. Hagen didn't. The dream started the same as the others. Back in Kosovo. It was Kosovo in '92. The unit had just been deployed to clear out a building. High-level enemy figure there, and Hagen's unit needed to get in, quick and quiet, grab or shoot the guy and get out. They had done it in 22 minutes. But in the dream, it was different. His men weren't armed. The enemy popped up with AK-47 knockoffs and opened fire. His men took cover, but they had nowhere to go. The insurgents came forward, never stopped the barrage. Lyman died. Ridley. Admanxi. Mahalik. Closer and closer, until Hagen heard bullets whizzing over his head. They'd surround him, they would all fire, and he would feel every bullet grinding him to pulp, just as he had on that horrible day at the restaurant. But this time, he reached down and realized he wasn't helpless. He pulled the gun from his holster. It was the gun, the one he'd found in the cloth. He fired 4 times, and 4 men lay dead. He woke up and pulled the lockbox from under the bed. He opened it and took out the gun. "Where did you come from?" he whispered. Something answered. He didn't hear the answer, only felt that something responded. Maybe it was in his mind, maybe he was half asleep. But something new he wanted to know. His phone rang.
Storied Weapons offers a variety of artifact weapons that have been blessed and cursed by the horrors of the world. These singular weapons, ranging from a spree-killing pistol that hungers to take life to an ancient soul-drinking sword, cannot be measured by cost. No, the cost to use and keep such dreaded tools is far worse, measured only in how much one is willing to sacrifice. Fighting Styles takes the idea of the fighting style merit and digs deep into just what such a style means. It readapts several of the existing fighting styles in a more granular way, and adds several new core, supplemental, and specialized fighting styles. Each style is based upon real-world martial arts training, and each is given new rules, histories, story hooks, and example practitioners. Future Weapons blows the lid off what one comes to expect regarding the use of weapons in a story. Prototype weaponry is featured here: guns that can shoot around corners, particle beam weapons, crowd-controlled devices, knives that detonate after being buried in a victim's flesh, and countless other instances of bleeding-edge combat horror. In addition, this provides storytelling advice on how to adapt such high-tech stuff for your horror games, as well as a portrait of a corrupt weapons manufacturer, the sinister Darkness-Armory. Combat Hacks takes a lurching run at combat, and attacks it with a pair of hatchets, then dices up all elements that go into the combat mechanics of the storytelling system, allowing you to rearrange them as your characters and story require. Vampires refer to themselves as kindred. All vampires belong to one of 5 different clans, which determine what supernatural powers they wield and some of their weaknesses. Many vampires also belong to covenants, organizations that fill the roles of religions, political parties, and secret societies. Vampires band together into small groups called coteries, which might form along lines of clan, covenant, or simple acquaintance. Werewolves are born to human parents, but undergo a first change sometime during their lives, at which point they discover their savage heritage. Werewolves refer to themselves as Uratha in their own language, or sometimes as Forsaken, those who ally themselves with Luna, the spirit of the moon, or pure, brutal, vicious werewolves who wage war on their lunar cousins. Forsaken werewolves take social roles called auspices, based upon what phase of the moon they first changed under, and many join tribes that provide training and support. The basic unit of werewolf existence, though, is the pack. Mages are human beings who awaken to mystical supernal realms and work their arcane powers through a connection to these places. Every mage walks a path, depending upon which realm she awakened to, and some join one of 5 orders, ancient fellowships that stretch back to a forgotten city of antiquity. A group of mages is called a cabal, while a local organization, usually composed of multiple cabals, is called a concilium. Prometheans, sometimes called the created, are living beings made of unliving flesh. Like the golem of Hebrew legend or Dr. Frankenstein's monster, these creatures are powerful, despised by humanity, and extremely rare. This is well, because Prometheans bring out the worst in people. Close proximity to Prometheans makes others suspicious, angry, jealous, and spiteful, and all of this ill will is focused squarely upon the Promethean. Each Promethean walks a pilgrimage, hoping to find the secret of mortality, and sometimes these beings are lucky enough to find others of their kind and band together into a throng. Prometheans descend from one of several lineages, based upon the first of that particular family, to gain sentience. A Promethean's approach to his pilgrimage is called a refinement, and this approach can, and usually does, change several times before the creature finds mortality. Changelings are people stolen by the others, the good folk, the beings from Arcadia. These hapless souls, sometimes called the Lost, have made their way back to the lands of their birth. Changelings are physically transformed by their time in captivity, taking on a seeming that informs their appearance and some of their magical capability. Changelings arrange themselves in feudal courts, named after the seasons of the year, and based roughly upon mystical and political outlook. Some live in fear that their tormentors will return. Others swear that if the good folk come for them, they will be ready. Most changelings come together into motleys, both for companionship and mutual protection. Hunters aren't supernatural beings, Paresi rather, They are human beings who have chosen or been chosen to protect humanity from the supernatural. Hunters are often obsessive and zealous, and over time can even appear quite insane, provided they survive their avocation long enough. Some hunters belong to compacts or conspiracies, organizations that can provide access to weapons, training and personnel to facilitate the vigil. Some hunters band together into local groups, scrounging whatever they can. And some face the darkness alone.
Gunnery Sergeant Red Cathcart turned over the pistol in his young hands, his nimble fingers. It had a brass barrel and a bone handle. He had found it in some rubble, some museum they blew king hell out of just a few nights back, and picked it up as a souvenir. Raheem darted through the rubble. The soldiers had long gone. The bombs were silent. This part of the city was destroyed, and for Raheem, it was a playground. He, the small Iraqi boy in his baggy pants and Bart Simpson t-shirt, laughed and dodged imaginary bullets. He did a rough and tumble roll under some blasted hunks of concrete and rebar, and when he returned to his feet, he found himself bathed in sunlight filtered through cracks in the ceiling above, motes of dust drifting down like angels. Glass lay everywhere. A pillar, once painted gold, had half of it blown out like a toothy bite from a giant. And beneath it sat a dark wooden case. It lay open, its inside draped in red velvet. Something lay swaddled in the soft cloth. Raheem unwound it. He found an old pistol, so old he couldn't imagine how it worked. Its handle may have been made of bone. He held it up and pretended to shoot, "Paku, Paku," and then ran off, laughing once more. "Sucker's old as fuck," Richmond muttered, sticking some chore in his mouth. "Older than my grandmother's pussy," Martinez cackled. But Cathcart wasn't listening. Up until now, the gun had felt empty. Light. Like it wasn't real, like it was missing something. Suddenly, it got heavy in his hands. Like he had a new mission, not from the core but from some higher, crueler source. For a moment, he thought he saw a boy's face in his mind's eye, laughing, maybe at him, it was hard to tell. His heart beat faster. His hand coiled around the old flintlock pistol. The tools of conquest do not necessarily come with explosions and bombs, and not necessarily with bombs and fallout. They're explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, attitudes, prejudices. Rod Serling, The Twilight Zone. This is the definition of the word storied, recorded or celebrated in history or story, the storied cities of ancient Greece, ornamented with designs representing historical, legendary, or similar subjects. Storied weapons can be weapons recorded in either history or mythology, or items ornamented with designs representing historical or legendary subjects. Often, these are weapons with place of pride in some horrific legend. Therefore, both definitions could be considered true. The world's full of sadists, despots, and murderers who had weapons with which they came to identify. An old Beretta that keeps showing up in the hands of students who go on to commit school shootings, a weapon that never shows up in the evidence store. The treasured machete of a Burmese warlord that burns with his lust for power. The club used to slay policemen during poll tax riots in the UK, still inspiring people to violent revolution. Each of these weapons has a history, each one is immortalized in the whispered tales of criminals, veterans, and law enforcement. Moreover, each of these weapons has a terrible price that a wielder must pay before it will accept him. All of the weapons have a cost. This doesn't measure the price, these weapons are unique, acting as characters in a story like any other storyteller character. Instead, the cost is either some ordeal that the character must go through in order to obtain the weapon, often the case for old weapons that have stringent restrictions on who may use them, or the consequences that a character must suffer for using the weapon. A character cannot avoid paying the price of a storied weapon, she's a part of the weapon story as much as it is a part of hers. If she does try to duck out of the consequences due her, she can be sure that they will strike even worse as a result of her presumption. Whatever force empowers these mysterious weapons, whether it's the devil or the collective fears of humanity, cannot be cheated. These weapons are both blessed and cursed, burdened by their history and drawn to the hands that might use them.
In each weapon, you'll find an elaborate history that details how the weapon came to be, from where it comes, and who has wielded it throughout history. Certainly each is deserving of evocative research, and characters witnessing such a weapon won't necessarily know anything about it. Hence, some degree of investigation will be necessary. The research is always a good place to start. Characters should be encouraged to pursue other avenues. Most importantly, research should always be a dynamic part of the story. Maybe the characters must pursue a series of clues that leads them from dusty tomb to a closed-off museum wing to the file cabinets of a United States senator. And something should always stand in their way, something beyond the mere chance of failure. What if someone is competing for the information, destroying it as they find it? Are they being pursued by assassins? Even something as simple as trying to break into those aforementioned cabinets, while not alerting the guards in the hallway, is a great form of suspense during actions related to research. Black Dawn always feels like it's at the wielder's body temperature, and the whole effect of carrying the gun is like giving a handshake to an old friend, often the wielder's only remaining friend. Made in 1976, the gun that has come to be known as Black Dawn carved a bloody path through the late 20th century. Its story begins in the hands of Ron Griffin, a New Jersey postal worker. One day, without warning, Ron walked calmly into his post office and shot 10 people dead before turning the gun on himself. He didn't speak a word to anyone. Maybe that one man's need to kill etched itself on the gun's soul. Maybe the steel used in the gun was the last to come from a factory that burned down in a mysterious fire, killing everyone within. Maybe the gun was just one of the devil's own from the start. Nobody's sure anymore. After the shooting, the pistol didn't reach the evidence locker. No policeman signed it out, and nobody gave it a second thought. A year later, the gun showed up in the hands of a 19-year-old gang thug in Columbia, South Carolina. The official statement notes that he got it from his father, but other people swear he bought it from the town's gun store or even found it when exploring an abandoned railroad car. He killed a lot of people with that gun, just walking down the city street and firing at any who ran from him. Thing is, it wasn't gang-related. It was just murder, raw and bloody, primal and without reason. When he was done, the boy pressed the gun up against his breastbone and pulled the trigger. But unlike the postal worker, the teen didn't succeed in taking his own life. Doctors saved his life, and he could stand trial as an adult for his terrible crimes. Only after he'd been put in prison did anyone notice that the gun was missing. The gun has found its way into the hands of other spree killers since then, disgruntled office workers, vengeful family members, drunken bargoers, homeless lunatics. One that stands out is the 1987 murder of 25 people in a botched raid on a Detroit meth lab. The murderer was Chris Rutger, a police officer who had taken the Black Dawn from his precinct's evidence locker to make a drop gun, a weapon that couldn't be traced back to him. With the grip wrapped in tape, he claimed in court that he only ever intended to shoot in self-defense. Testimony from other officers at the scene and forensic evidence both show him for a liar. Upon entering the lab, he drew the gun and smiled softly. One of the officers heard him say, "Thanks, Dad." At the time, the officers thought nothing of it. As soon as Rutger could get a good shot off, he took it. The other officers looked on in shock as he walked calmly through the lab, shooting dead everyone he encountered. One of the officers attempted to stop him, and he shot her. Fortunately, the bullet hit her in the leg. Before any of the others could take him out, he put the gun into his mouth and pulled the trigger. As with the first school shooting involving the gun, Chris Rutger survived the suicide attempt. He told the court that he didn't know what came over him, that it was like the gun was an old friend of the family, and he was catching up. Pulling the trigger felt good. The jury didn't believe that he was mentally unstable, and took his statement as an admission of guilt. Officer Rutger was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He killed himself after 8 months in jail, finishing the job that he couldn't complete with Black Dawn. The gun was sold off at police auction, but nobody remembers the buyer. Media coverage of the killing lit up the country for 2 days, including the headline, "Black Dawn for Detroit Police." The meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev soon drove it from the public's attention, but law enforcement took to calling the gun Black Dawn when they encountered it.